tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. And if you're settling in expecting a straightforward bedtime story about ancient Mesopotamia, well, you probably won't survive this, because we're about to wade through thousands of years of divine drama, cosmic real estate disputes, and the kind of family feuds that make your Thanksgiving dinner look like a meditation retreat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I'm not interested in reluctant subscribers who clicked by accident while trying to find cat videos. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are, because there's something beautifully strange about knowing someone in Melbourne is hearing this at dawn while someone in Chicago drifts off at midnight. All of us connected by these ancient words that have somehow survived empires rising and falling like bread dough in a particularly enthusiastic bakery. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to southern Mesopotamia, to the land between two rivers where the Tigris and Euphrates create ribbons of life through otherwise unforgiving desert. And imagine yourself standing in a temple complex in the city of Eridu around 4500 BCE, the air thick with incense that smells of juniper and cedar, the kind of smoke that makes your eyes water slightly but in a way that feels sacred rather than irritating, like the building itself is breathing out perfume, and you're surrounded by priests in white linen robes that probably haven't been washed as often as modern sensibilities would prefer. But we're not here to judge ancient laundry practices. We're here because these priests are the keepers of stories, the ones who will eventually press these tales into wet clay with reed styluses, creating the first written narratives humanity will ever produce, which is frankly remarkable when you consider that someone had to invent the entire concept of writing just to gossip about what the gods were up to, talk about dedication to the craft. And the story they tell begins not with humans at all, but with the Anunnaki, a word that translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, which is either a straightforward description of divine beings, or, if you listen to certain enthusiastic researchers with more questions than tenure, a technical manual for extraterrestrial arrival procedures. But we'll get to that peculiar interpretation in a moment. First, let's establish what the actual ancient texts tell us, because the Sumerians themselves left us remarkable detail in documents like the Enuma Elish and the Eridu Genesis. And according to these clay tablets, in the beginning there was only Namu, the primordial sea, existing in that undefined state that ancient creation myths love so much, where nothing is separate and everything is potential, like a cosmic soup that hasn't decided what kind of soup it wants to be yet. And from Namu emerges An, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess, and their union produces Enlil, the god of air and storms, who immediately does what any self-respecting storm god would do and separates heaven from earth, creating the space in which everything else can exist, which must have been quite the dramatic moment. Imagine the sound of the first separation, reality splitting like fabric, though hopefully with less of a tearing noise and more of a satisfying whoosh. And now we have the basic structure of the universe: sky, earth, and the air between them, a cosmic sandwich if you will, though calling it that probably diminishes the gravitas somewhat. And here's where it gets interesting, because the Sumerian king list, an actual historical document that mainstream scholars treat as a valuable though problematic source, tells us that before the flood, before human kings ruled in recognizable historical terms, kingship descended from heaven, and the earliest rulers had impossibly long reigns. We're talking tens of thousands of years, which either represents some confusion between different calendaring systems, or symbolic rather than literal timekeeping, or, and here's where we veer into the fringe territory that makes archaeology professors develop stress tics, these were actual biological entities with radically extended lifespans due to different atmospheric conditions or advanced genetic manipulation, depending on which rabbit hole you're willing to tumble down tonight. And the scholarly debate around these king lists is actually fascinating, because you have serious academics like Thorkild Jacobsen, who spent decades trying to extract historical kernels from mythological chaff, arguing that, Underneath the exaggeration, there might be real political successions, while others like Samuel Noah Kramer treated the entire antediluvian period as purely mythological, a golden age story that every culture seems to need, where things were better and people were greater, and nobody had invented traffic jams yet. And somewhere in between, you have researchers trying to correlate Sumerian flood narratives with actual geological events in the Persian Gulf. Because apparently, we can't just enjoy a good flood story without wondering if there's archaeological evidence for catastrophic inundation around 5000 BCE, which there might be. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests massive flooding could have displaced populations and created lasting cultural memories, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still in the temple at Eridu, and the priests are explaining how the Anunnaki number in their hundreds, sometimes described as 50 great gods, sometimes 7 judges of the underworld, sometimes 600 stationed between heaven and earth, because ancient consistency was apparently optional, like grammar rules in a text message, and these beings have names that you can feel in your mouth when you say them. Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Ninhursag, Utu, each one carrying responsibilities for different aspects of existence, and they're not distant abstract forces but personalities with desires and grudges and romantic entanglements that would make a soap opera writer weep with envy. These gods get drunk. They play tricks on each other, they have favorite cities and least favorite relatives. Enlil, for instance, is characterized as authoritative but also kind of grumpy, the sort of deity who would definitely complain about noise from the neighbors, which actually becomes a plot point later when humans get too loud for his liking. Spoiler alert. It doesn't end well for humanity, but we're not there yet. Right now we're still in the age before humans, when the Anunnaki are doing all the work themselves, and this is where the text describes something that modern readers find curious. The gods are laboring, digging irrigation canals, maintaining the waterways, essentially performing the agricultural infrastructure work that will later define Mesopotamian civilization, and they're not happy about it. The younger gods especially are exhausted, their divine hands blistered from shovels, which raises interesting questions about what exactly divine flesh is made of if it can blister. Perhaps it's metaphorical, or perhaps the Sumerians understood their gods as more physical than we typically imagine ancient deities, less pure spirit and more superpowered beings who still had to deal with lower back pain after a long day of canal digging. And there's a rebellious undertone building. You can almost hear the divine grumbling around the cosmic water cooler. Why are we doing this? We're gods, for heaven's sake. Which is a joke that probably doesn't translate well from ancient Sumerian, but I'm making it anyway because we're several hundred words in and you deserve at least one groan-worthy pun, and this dissatisfaction is crucial to the narrative because it sets up the entire reason for human creation. We're not made out of some generous divine love or cosmic loneliness. We're made because the gods needed workers, which is perhaps the most honest creation myth ever recorded. No pretense about being specially chosen or beloved, just straight up. We needed someone to do the hard stuff, and you seemed manageable. There's something refreshingly cynical about it, and the temple you're standing in, this complex at Eridu, is itself significant because mainstream archaeology confirms this was one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to around 5400 BCE, making it genuinely ancient even by ancient standards. And the Sumerians themselves considered Eridu the first city, the place where civilization began, where kingship first descended, and there's something poetic about how the oldest city was dedicated to Enki, god of water and wisdom, because water is life in this desert landscape. Control water and you control survival, and wisdom is recognizing that fundamental truth, and the priests performing rituals here aren't just playing pretend, they're maintaining cosmic order through repetition and precision. Every gesture matters, every word spoken is a word that's been spoken for generations, creating continuity with something larger than individual human existence, and you can feel the weight of that responsibility in how seriously they take their work, the careful copying of tablets, the exact measurements of offerings, the specific hymns for specific occasions, because if you're going to claim you're communicating with beings who can flood the entire world when annoyed, you probably want to get the details right. No room for improvisation when you're dealing with gods who predate human language. And here's where I should mention that some researchers, and I'm looking at you, Zechariah Sitchin, and your devoted followers who fill comment sections with passionate defenses of ancient astronaut theories, interpret these Anunnaki not as mythological deities but as extraterrestrial visitors who genetically engineered humanity for labor purposes, essentially reading the Sumerian texts as literal historical accounts of alien colonization, which is a bold hermeneutical choice, taking poetic metaphor and cosmological framework and deciding, no, this is actually a mining operation manual. And while mainstream scholarship treats this interpretation with about as much enthusiasm as a dental appointment, there's no denying it's captured popular imagination, the idea that ancient peoples were describing real events but lacked the vocabulary to explain advanced technology, so they used the language available to them, gods, heaven, divine power, when what they meant was spacecraft, genetic laboratories, and beings from another planet. And I'm not here to tell you what to believe, I'm just here to help you fall asleep while contemplating whether your existence is the result of divine inspiration or extraterrestrial staffing shortages. Sweet dreams, but the textual evidence from actual Sumerian sources describes these beings in thoroughly theological terms, with divine epithets and mythological genealogies and characteristics that fit patterns we see across many ancient cultures. The storm god who separates heaven from earth appears in different forms across the Near East. Enlil has cousins in Baal and Zeus and Thor. These are archetypal patterns humans use to understand natural forces and social structures, projecting order onto chaos, creating narrative frameworks that help make sense of why storms destroy crops, and why social hierarchies exist, and why some people have power while others labor in fields. And the debate between literal and metaphorical interpretation of ancient texts isn't new. Medieval scholars argued about it. Renaissance humanists puzzled over it. Every generation has to decide how to read texts that claim impossible things, whether to find historical kernels or appreciate mythological meaning, or sometimes just enjoy the story. And standing here in this temple with smoke curling toward reed-matted ceilings, you realize that for the people who originally told these stories, the distinction between literal and metaphorical might not have been as clear as we want it to be. They inhabited a world where divine presence was assumed, where offerings disappeared into sacred precincts and priests emerged with messages from gods, where dreams carried weight and omens directed politics, and the boundary between physical and spiritual was more like a permeable membrane than a solid wall. And trying to force modern categories onto ancient worldviews is a bit like trying to explain internet memes to your great-grandmother. Technically possible, but missing something essential in translation, and the priests are still chanting, their voices creating layers of sound that fill the sacred space, repetitive patterns that induce a trance-like state, which is perhaps the whole point. Altered consciousness as a doorway to whatever divine realm might exist, or at least to a psychological state where communal belief becomes shared experience, and you're feeling it too. The weight of incense and repetition, and the knowledge that you're standing on ground that humans have considered holy for thousands of years, which is enough to give anyone pause regardless of their theological commitments. There's power in continuity, in knowing that your actions connect to countless others across time, that the words you speak were spoken by people whose names are lost, but whose faith shaped civilizations and outside these temple walls. The Mesopotamian night is falling. Stars emerging with that crystalline clarity you only get in desert climates, the same stars the Anunnaki supposedly descended from, and whether you interpret that as metaphor for divine transcendence or instruction manual for spacecraft trajectories, the beauty remains, points of light in infinite darkness, and somewhere in that darkness the gods are watching, or aliens are monitoring, or there's nothing but nuclear fusion and gravity. But the story continues regardless, because humans are going to be created soon, the next phase of this cosmic drama, but not yet, not in this first section. Right now we're still in the age of divine labor and building discontent, the pressure building toward a solution that will change everything, and the priests know how this story goes. They've told it countless times, each telling slightly different because oral tradition allows for flexibility, emphasis shifting depending on audience and occasion, but the core remains. Gods laboring, gods complaining, gods seeking a solution, and you're warm and comfortable, and your breathing is slowing, matching the rhythm of those ancient chants, and somewhere in the back of your mind you're cataloging questions to research tomorrow. What do actual Assyriologists say about Anunnaki etymology? How do we date these texts? What's the connection between Sumerian and later Babylonian versions? But for now, you're just here, in this moment, in this temple, in this story. And that's enough, more than enough. It's everything, because stories are how we make meaning, how we connect past to present, how we fall asleep when the world feels too large and confusing. We return to the oldest tales and find comfort in their survival. If these words lasted 5,000 years, they must mean something, must carry something worth preserving, and whether that something is historical fact or mythological truth or cultural memory or just a really good yarn about dysfunctional divine families, you're part of it now. Hearing these words, these names, Namu and An and Enlil and the Anunnaki, who will shape everything that follows, and the night deepens around you. The scene shifts now, though you haven't moved, because this is how dream logic works, and ancient narratives too. We're following the thread of story, rather than the logic of geography, and we find ourselves in the marshlands of southern Iraq, the reedy wetlands where fresh water from the rivers meets the salt water of the Persian Gulf, creating a unique ecosystem that the ancient Sumerians called the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm that Enki controls. And Enki himself is fascinating because he's the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of crafts and magic. And unlike the stern authoritarian Enlil, Enki is portrayed as clever and sometimes mischievous, the sort of deity who would help humans even when it annoyed the other gods, a trickster with good intentions. And here in his temple workshop, surrounded by water and reeds and the croaking of frogs that somehow sounds rhythmic in the night, Enki is contemplating the problem of divine labor, because the gods are tired. They've been digging canals for what feels like eons, which when you're immortal probably actually is eons. Time gets weird when you don't age, and there's been a rebellion. The younger gods threw down their tools. This is actually described in the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important Akkadian texts we have, dating to around 1700 BCE but preserving much older Sumerian material. And in this text, the gods surround Enlil's house at night, and it's presented almost comically, divine beings with torches and grievances, like the world's first labor strike, except the workers can shoot lightning from their fingers. And Enlil is upset. How dare they? But Enki, ever the diplomat, suggests a solution. Create a substitute worker, a lulu, a term that means something like primitive worker or mixed one. And this is where it gets interesting, because the process described in these texts involves mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, specifically a god who led the rebellion, Ila or Geshtui, depending on which version you read, and the mingling of divine and earthly materials to create humans is presented as a ritual act. Ninhursag, the birth goddess, shapes the clay, 7 male and 7 female forms, and breathes life into them. And suddenly, there are humans, not descended from gods, but constructed by them, assembled rather than born, which is a very different creation narrative than we find in many other cultures, where humans are children of deities or shaped from cosmic eggs or emerge from underworld realms. Here we're explicitly made as tools, as solutions to a labor problem. And I mentioned this is interesting because it reflects the actual social structure of Sumerian civilization, which was organized around temple complexes that controlled agricultural production, with a small priestly elite managing large populations of workers. So the creation myth justifies and mirrors the social reality. Humans serve the gods through their earthly representatives, the priests, working the field so that offerings can be made, maintaining the system that sustains civilization. Its ideology embedded in cosmology, and scholars like Jean Bottero have written extensively about how Mesopotamian religion was fundamentally about service. The whole point of human existence was to feed and clothe the gods through offerings and maintain their temples, which sounds rather grim when stated baldly, but was apparently satisfying enough that the civilization lasted for 3,000 years, which is longer than most modern nation-states can hope for. So perhaps there's something to be said for having a clear sense of purpose, even if that purpose is Keep the gods fed. Better than wandering through existence wondering what it's all for. At least the Sumerians knew what they were for, though I suspect the average barley farmer had more complex thoughts about meaning and purpose than the official theology acknowledged. People generally do, but we work with the texts we have, and the texts we have are written by and for the elite. The priests and kings who benefited from the system, the workers who actually dug the canals and planted the grain didn't leave us lengthy philosophical treatises. Funny how that works. History recorded by those with the leisure and education to record it, which means we're always getting a skewed perspective. But I digress. We're in Enki's workshop and humans are being created, and the description includes details about how the first humans were shaped in batches of 7 and how Ninhursag pinches off 14 pieces of clay, and how divine blood is mixed in to give these clay forms intelligence and understanding. And if you're thinking this sounds a bit like genetic engineering, well, you wouldn't be the first. The ancient astronaut theorists have a field day with these passages, reading divine blood as DNA and clay as base biological materials and shaping as genetic. Manipulation, turning what mainstream scholarship treats as mythological metaphor for human creation into a literal description of biological engineering by an advanced species. And while there's absolutely no scientific evidence for this interpretation, no genetic markers suggesting extraterrestrial tampering, no archaeological artifacts that couldn't be explained by human ingenuity, there's something compelling about the narrative symmetry. Ancient texts describing creation, modern readers reinterpreting them through contemporary scientific paradigms. Each generation finds in ancient myths the concerns of their own time. Medieval scholars saw Christian symbolism in pagan texts. Enlightenment thinkers found rational allegory. Victorians discovered evolution myths, and we find ancient astronauts. It's like a Rorschach test. The texts stay the same, but what we see in them shifts, revealing more about us than them, which isn't to say the texts are meaningless. Quite the opposite. They're so rich with meaning that they can sustain multiple interpretations across millennia. That's the mark of powerful narrative. It survives because it's flexible, because each new reader can find something relevant, and the debate about how literally to take these creation accounts has occupied scholars for generations. You have the maximalist position that treats the texts as preserving genuine historical memories however distorted, and the minimalist position that treats them as essentially fictional constructs serving social and religious functions, and most scholars end up somewhere in the middle, recognizing that myths often contain historical kernels while being primarily theological and literary works, not stenographic records. But trying to extract the kernels is tricky, like trying to find specific grains of sand on a beach. You know they're there, but identification is nearly impossible. And meanwhile Enki is pleased with his solution. Humans are created, and they're immediately put to work, taking over the canal digging and field ploughing and all the agricultural labor that makes civilization possible, and the gods can finally relax, which presumably they do with the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of piña coladas, perhaps date wine and honey cakes, settling into their temples while humans swarm across the landscape, multiplying rapidly because that's what biological organisms do when conditions allow. And here's a quirky detail from the texts. Humans were apparently made with a built-in time limit. We age and die unlike the gods, and some versions suggest this was deliberate, a way to prevent humans from becoming too powerful or too numerous, which raises interesting questions about whether mortality is a design feature or a design flaw. The Sumerians clearly thought it was intentional, death as a control mechanism, which is rather darker than the death gives life meaning philosophical spin we sometimes put on. Mortality, they're saying no. Death keeps you in your place, reminds you that you're not divine, ensures you can't accumulate enough knowledge or power to challenge the gods. It's a governance strategy, and once you see it that way, you can't unsee it. Mortality as social control, built into biology, and whether you find this depressing or oddly reassuring probably depends on your temperament. Personally, I find there's something almost comforting about the honesty. No pretense that death is a gift or a transition to something better, just straightforward acknowledgement that it's a limitation, and limitations define us as much as capabilities. We're the beings who die, who must accomplish what we can in bounded time, and that creates urgency and meaning. The gods have forever and they spend it bickering and getting drunk. We have decades and we build cities and write poems and love each other with the desperate intensity of creatures who know it ends. Maybe the Sumerians were onto something. Maybe we got the better deal after all, finite but free in our finitude, which is getting far too philosophical for a bedtime script. But insomnia has to be good for something, and pondering Sumerian mortality theology beats counting sheep, or perhaps supplements it, counting sheep while considering whether those sheep also contemplate their mortality. Probably not. Sheep seem content in their sheepness, untroubled by existential questions, which is either enviable or boring depending on your perspective. And we're now several paragraphs into this section, and I've included a joke about divine piña coladas and a reflection on mortality that might be too heavy for sleep content, but trust me, we're building towards something. The narrative is constructing itself around you like those temples being built across Mesopotamia, brick by brick, each one slightly different but all serving the same basic function, creating sacred space, separating the divine from the mundane, giving structure to belief, and humans are thriving now, generations passing, and they're developing culture, inventing things, because humans are creative in ways that apparently surprise the gods. We weren't just supposed to dig canals. We started making art and music and telling our own stories, and the texts suggest the gods found this both amusing and slightly concerning, like parents realizing their children have personalities and opinions. It's one thing to create workers, another thing entirely when those workers start having ideas, and Enki seems to have a soft spot for his creations. Several myths show him helping humans, teaching them various crafts and technologies, sometimes against the wishes of other gods. He's like the cool uncle who teaches you to swear and lets you stay up late, except divine and Sumerian and partially responsible for your entire species. But the metaphor holds. Enlil is the strict father, Enki is the permissive uncle, and humans benefit from their disagreements, slipping through the gaps in divine consensus. And there are tablets that describe Enki giving humanity agriculture, teaching them to build, sharing knowledge of metalworking and medicine, essentially uplifting the species beyond its original designed purpose. And you can read this as mythology explaining cultural development, each technological advance credited to divine teaching because ancient peoples didn't have a framework for understanding innovation as human-generated, or you can read it as literal history of extraterrestrial technology transfer, depending on your interpretive commitments, and the scholarly consensus is definitely the former. These are etiological myths, stories explaining origins. Why do we have agriculture? Because Enki taught us. Why do we work metal? Because Enki showed us. It's a narrative way of acknowledging that knowledge came from somewhere, was learned somehow, even if the actual historical process was gradual experimentation and discovery over generations. But gods make better stories than slowly figured it out through trial and error over centuries. Divine intervention is more dramatic than statistical probability, which is why myths are myths and not anthropology textbooks. Though honestly, some anthropology textbooks could use more divine intervention in the narrative pacing. I'm just saying, academia has many virtues, but compelling storytelling isn't always among them. And now humans are spreading across Mesopotamia, establishing settlements, each one with its own temple and patron deity, because the Sumerian religious system was organized around city-states. Each city had its main god. Eridu had Enki, Nippur had Enlil, Uruk had Inanna, and these cities were essentially theocratic states. The temple owned the land, controlled production, organized labor, collected offerings, and redistributed resources. It was a complex economic system disguised as religious devotion. Or perhaps religious devotion providing the organizing principle for economic systems. The distinction gets blurry, religion and economics and politics all tangled together in ways that would confuse modern categories. We like our separations, church and state, sacred and secular, but ancient Mesopotamia didn't work that way. The temple was the bank and the government and the spiritual center and the granary all at once. priest kings managing divine resources on behalf of gods who lived in the temple's inner sanctum, or at least whose statues resided there, which amounted to the same thing in terms of political power, and this is all historically documented. We have economic tablets from temple archives, records of offerings and expenditures, contracts and receipts written in cuneiform on clay tablets that survived because clay is nearly indestructible if you fire it or accidentally burn down the building it's stored in, which happened often enough that we have excellent archaeological preservation. Every catastrophe is a future historian's treasure, which is a rather morbid thought but demonstrably true. We know more about Pompeii than most Roman cities because a volcano preserved it in ash. We understand Mesopotamian temple economics because fires baked their records. Destruction preserves. Time erases only what survives time, which is paradoxical but accurate, and humans are multiplying, cities growing, and the noise is increasing. This becomes important. Remember I mentioned Enlil complaining about noise? Well, the Atrahasis epic describes this explicitly. Humans have become so numerous and so loud that Enlil can't sleep, which is possibly the most relatable divine complaint in any mythology. Even gods just want some peace and quiet, and his solution is characteristically extreme. He decides to reduce the human population through various means, first disease, then drought, then famine, and each time Enki secretly helps humanity survive, teaching them how to propitiate the gods, how to make offerings that will stop the plague or bring rain, undermining Enlil's population control measures, and the tension between these two gods, between strict authority and clever mercy, plays out across multiple myths. They represent different principles: order versus creativity, justice versus compassion, and humans benefit from their conflict, playing one against the other, surviving through cunning and divine sponsorship. And this is actually a sophisticated theological framework, acknowledging that divine will isn't monolithic, that gods disagree, that cosmic order requires negotiation, not just decree. It's more politically realistic than monotheistic systems that have to explain evil and suffering while maintaining an all-powerful, benevolent deity. The Sumerians just said, well, the gods disagree. Some help us, some don't. Some are having a bad day. Better make extra offerings just in case. It's practically conflict resolution through bribery, which is cynical but probably reflected actual political realities, where local rulers needed to be appeased with gifts and tribute, and the myths naturalize these relationships, making them cosmic and eternal rather than contingent and human, which is what state religions do. They take power structures and declare them divinely ordained, thereby removing them from criticism or change. You can't argue with the gods, or you can, but it's risky. Better to accept that this is how things are because this is how the gods made them. And yet the texts also preserve resistance. Enki helping humans, slaves creating their own gods, the poor having different relationships with the divine than the wealthy. Hegemony is never total. There are always gaps and contradictions, and these ancient texts preserve them, which makes them more interesting than pure propaganda would be. There's genuine tension, real questions about justice and power, whether might makes right, or whether even gods can be wrong, and these are questions humans still ask. We're not so different from those Sumerian workers wondering if their suffering serves any purpose beyond enriching the temple. Every generation asks whether the system is just or merely powerful, and the myths don't provide simple answers. Enlil has his reasons, Enki has his. Humans muddle through, sometimes thriving, sometimes suffering, and the cosmos continues, indifferent to individual happiness, but providing just enough order that civilization remains possible, which might be the best we can hope for. Cosmic indifference with occasional divine intervention, usually when you least expect it and most need it, or perhaps just when random chance aligns with human effort, depending on whether you believe in divine providence or statistical probability. And honestly, at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep, does it matter? The comfort is in the story either way, in knowing humans have always struggled with these questions, always told themselves tales about gods and creation and purpose, always looked at the stars and wondered, and that continuity is its own kind of meaning. You're part of a species that's been pondering existence for at least 5,000 years and probably much longer. We've been asking, why are we here since we developed language complex enough to ask it? And we still don't have a definitive answer, which is either frustrating or liberating. No cosmic purpose means we create our own, which is terrifying freedom, or we serve divine plans we can't fully understand, which is comforting limitation. The Sumerians chose the latter. We serve the gods by serving their temples, by maintaining civilization, and if that seems reductive, well, it sustained complex urban society for 3 millennia, gave millions of lives structure and meaning, produced art and literature that we still study. They must have been doing something right, even if their creation myth is basically, gods needed workers so they made us from clay and blood. There's an honesty to that origin story. No pretense that we're the cosmos's favorite children. Just acknowledgement that we serve a function, we're part of the system, necessary components, and maybe that's enough. Being necessary, having a role, contributing to something larger, even if that something is just maintaining irrigation canals and offering barley to divine statues. At least you know what you're supposed to do, which is more than many modern humans can say. We have freedom and choice and existential vertigo. The Sumerians had obligation and structure and the comfort of knowing their place. Neither system is perfect. Both have profound limitations, but here in Enki's workshop, watching humanity get created and populated and problematized, you can appreciate the elegance of the narrative, how it explains so much, why we work, why we die, why the gods sometimes help and sometimes don't, why we're intelligent but limited, mortal but creative. It's a complete cosmology, internally consistent, explaining the world as ancient Mesopotamians experienced it, and the fact that we now have different explanations, evolution and chemistry and cosmology, doesn't entirely erase the appeal of the story. There's still something resonant about being shaped with purpose. Even if we reject the literal truth, we can appreciate the metaphorical weight. We are shaped by our circumstances, by our biology and culture and history. We do serve functions in larger systems. We are mortal and creative, and the universe does seem indifferent to individual suffering. The Sumerians just anthropomorphized these realities into gods, and we abstract them into forces, but the existential situation is similar, and maybe that's why these stories still work as bedtime narratives. They speak to something fundamental even across vast gulfs of time and culture. We're still the anxious clever, mortal creatures wondering about our origins and purposes, still looking for stories that make the darkness less dark. And on that note, let's move forward in our timeline. Humans created and multiplying, gods watching with mixed feelings, and problems brewing on the horizon. Now we're moving forward in mythological time, though time moves strangely in these narratives, sometimes racing through centuries in a sentence, sometimes lingering for pages on a single conversation between deities, and we're entering the period that the Sumerian king list calls the age when kingship descended from heaven, when cities were established and dynastic rulers organized human populations under divine mandate. And this is where myth starts blending into something closer to history, not accurate history necessarily, but history adjacent, names that might refer to real people however mythologized, cities that definitely existed, events that could have historical cause, and the transition is gradual, less a sharp boundary than a slow fade from purely mythological time into legendary time into historical time, like watching sunrise where you can't quite identify the moment darkness becomes dawn, but suddenly you realize you can see, and scholars debate exactly where this transition occurs, at what point Sumerian narratives become historically useful versus purely theological, and the consensus is frustratingly vague. Somewhere in the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE, things start becoming potentially historical. Before that it's mythology, after that it's complicated, and the complications are what make it interesting. We have king lists that give absurdly long reigns for early rulers. Alulim of Eridu supposedly ruled for 28,800 years, which is either a scribal error or a different calendrical system or symbolic numerology, or proof that antediluvian humans were essentially immortal, depending on your interpretive framework, and mainstream scholarship goes with some combination of the first three options. These numbers are symbolic or confused or corrupted through transmission. They're not meant to be literal chronology, but the ancient astronaut theorists look at those numbers and see evidence of genetic manipulation providing extended lifespans, or time dilation effects from relativistic space travel, because why settle for simple explanations when you can invoke Einstein and aliens simultaneously? It's hermeneutical creativity, I'll give them that, turning ancient texts into science fiction, which is almost impressive in its audacity, reading Alulim ruled 28,800 years, and concluding, obviously, he was part Anunnaki with modified telomeres, rather than, obviously this number is symbolic or erroneous, and I'm being sarcastic, but there's also something democratic about interpretation. The texts are public domain, anyone can read them and draw conclusions. Academic consensus doesn't own truth, even if it has methodology and evidence on its side. People believe what resonates with their existing frameworks, which is why the same text spawns archaeology and ancient astronaut theory, peer-reviewed papers and YouTube videos with dramatic music. Humans find what they're looking for. Confirmation bias is powerful. We see patterns whether they're there or not, agency in randomness, intention in accident, and ancient texts are Rorschach tests as I mentioned earlier. Show me a Sumerian king list, and I'll tell you my assumptions about what's possible. And right now we're in the heavenly realm where things are getting tense because the gods are quarreling, which they do frequently, and the texts preserve these conflicts in surprising detail, familial drama on a cosmic scale, and the big issue is authority. Who's in charge, which god has precedence, and different cities have different answers, because remember each city-state has its own patron deity, so of course their myths emphasize their god's importance. Nippur's texts glorify Enlil, Eridu's texts emphasize Enki, Uruk's texts celebrate Inanna, its civic pride expressed through theology. Our god is better than your god, therefore our city is better than your city. And these theological disputes mirror political conflicts. When cities went to war, they framed it as their gods going to war, divine conflict justifying human violence, which is a pattern that continues through history, wrapping political ambitions in religious authority. Gods want this territory, this resource, this dominance. Never mind that the gods conveniently want exactly what the human rulers want. Funny how that works. And the texts describe divine councils, assemblies where the gods meet to decide cosmic matters, and it's portrayed almost like a parliament. Enlil presiding, other gods making arguments, votes taken, and this reflects Sumerian political assemblies. They had councils of elders, they understood collective decision-making, and they projected this structure onto heaven. Gods operate like humans because humans created gods in our image. We say gods created us, but really we created them, shaped them to reflect our social structures and psychological needs, which doesn't mean gods don't exist in some ultimate sense. That's a different question, but the Sumerian gods as described in texts are clearly human constructions, too specific, too petty, too invested in Mesopotamian geography to be cosmic forces. They're localized deities, powerful but bounded, and one of the major conflicts involves Inanna, goddess of love and war, which is a fascinating combination, connecting sexuality and violence, desire and destruction, and she's portrayed as ambitious, wanting more power than traditionally allocated to her, and there's a famous myth where she decides to visit the underworld ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, and this goes poorly. Inanna is killed and hung on a hook like meat, which is remarkably graphic for mythology, and she has to be rescued through Enki's cleverness, and the whole thing reads as a meditation on mortality and the limits of divine power. Even gods can die in certain circumstances. Death claims everything eventually, and Inanna's descent and return has been interpreted as seasonal allegory, the death and rebirth of vegetation, or as political metaphor about the vulnerability of power, or as psychological journey through shadow aspects of self. And all these interpretations are valid because myths are polysemous. They mean multiple things simultaneously, resisting single readings, which makes them resilient, adaptable to different contexts and needs. And Inanna is associated with Uruk, one of the great cities of Sumer, and the archaeological evidence confirms Uruk was genuinely impressive, massive temple complexes, sophisticated urban planning, thousands of inhabitants. This wasn't mythology. This was a real city that housed real people who believed their goddess protected them. And when Uruk went to war with other cities, they believed Inanna fought beside them, which psychologically probably helped. Going into battle thinking you have divine support versus going in thinking you're just meat with spears, the former is more motivating, and religious belief serves practical functions, creating cohesion and courage. Whether or not the gods literally exist, they exist psychologically. In the minds of believers they're real, and that reality has consequences, structures behavior. motivates action, and the Sumerian gods were real to Sumerians in ways that matter, even if they weren't literally real in ways philosophers argue about. And meanwhile on Earth, cities are growing and competing. Early dynastic Sumer around 2350 BCE was a landscape of rival city-states, Uruk and Ur and Lagash and Umma and Eridu and Nippur, each one controlling surrounding agricultural land, each one conducting diplomacy and warfare with neighbors, and the gods supposedly directed these conflicts. But really, human rulers made decisions and claimed divine mandate. Eannatum of Lagash sets up a stele showing him leading troops while his god Ningirsu hovers overhead in divine approval, which is propaganda, depicting divine support for political authority but effective propaganda. Subjects believe their king is divinely chosen, less likely to rebel, more likely to die in wars benefiting the elite. And I'm being cynical, but state formation required ideology, required beliefs that made people willing to be governed and taxed and conscripted, and religion provided that ideology. The gods want social hierarchy. The gods want you to obey the king. The gods will punish rebellion, and whether priests believed this or cynically deployed it is unknowable, probably both depending on the individual, some true believers, some calculators, most somewhere between, like modern politicians who express religious conviction with varying degrees of sincerity, same dynamics, different deities, and the scholarly debate about Sumerian state formation involves economics and irrigation management and military capacity, but also ideology, also religion, also the stories people told themselves about why they were organized this way. And myths matter. They're not just entertaining tales, but foundational narratives that structure reality. And when those narratives say humans exist to serve gods and gods authorize kings and kings organize civilization, that's a powerful legitimating framework. And it worked. Sumerian civilization lasted thousands of years, survived invasions and assimilations and transformations. The cultural legacy persists. We're still reading these texts, still studying their language. They achieved immortality through literature, if not through individual survival, which might be the best anyone can hope for. Leave something behind, words or buildings or children or art, some trace that you existed, that you meant something to someone, that you participated in the great human project of meaning-making. And the Sumerians left us their myths and their king lists and their economic tablets and their cylinder seals, fragments of daily life and cosmic belief tangled together in archaeological layers, and we excavate and translate and interpret and argue, each generation of scholars finding something new, emphasizing different aspects, because scholarship is also interpretation. There's no pure objective reading. We all bring our questions and assumptions. And right now, academic Assyriology is interested in gender and social structure. Previous generations cared more about political history and cultural influence. Future scholars will have their own concerns, and the texts remain, patient clay witnesses to everything we project onto them, and the gods are still quarreling in heaven, Enlil and Enki disagreeing about humanity's fate, Inanna pursuing her ambitions, and humans are caught in the middle, benefiting from divine disagreement, surviving through cleverness and offerings, and there's a certain grim humor in the Sumerian worldview. We're pawns in divine games, our suffering mostly incidental to cosmic politics. But we persist, we adapt, we find joy where we can. Even the myths acknowledge this. Humans feast and love and create despite mortality and divine indifference. Life asserts itself against considerable odds, which is quietly heroic when you think about it. Just continuing, just maintaining civilization in the face of floods and droughts and wars and the knowledge that the gods might decide to wipe you out for being too noisy. That takes courage or stubbornness or both, and Sumerians had both in abundance. They built in a floodplain, they lived with constant environmental uncertainty, and they thrived anyway, developing writing and mathematics and astronomy and literature, not despite their mythology but perhaps because of it. Belief that they served cosmic purpose gave structure to their efforts. They weren't just surviving, they were maintaining sacred order, keeping the gods fed, ensuring the cosmos continued functioning, which is a heavy responsibility but also a meaningful one. Your daily work contributes to universal stability. That's not nothing. That might be everything, and as the section draws toward its close, we're seeing the cracks forming. human population growing, divine patience wearing thin, the noise increasing, and Enlil in particular is becoming irritated, which doesn't bode well for humanity. Gods with irritation and power are dangerous combinations, and Enki is trying to mediate, always trying to protect his creations. But there are limits to what even a clever god can do when the chief of the divine council decides action is necessary and action is coming. Drastic action, the kind that will reshape everything. But we're not there yet. We're still in the time of relative stability, cities flourishing, civilization developing, humans multiplying across the land, not knowing that a reckoning approaches, and that's always how catastrophe works, isn't it? Life continues normally until suddenly it doesn't. People going about their business, planting and harvesting, and loving and quarreling and dying, the small human dramas that fill existence, not realizing that cosmic forces are gathering, that divine patience is exhausted, that the world as they know it is about to end. But for now there's peace, relatively speaking, and humans are creating culture, inventing things, pushing boundaries, and some of the gods are proud of their creations. Look what they've accomplished, and some are worried. They're getting too smart, too numerous, too loud, and that tension builds across decades and centuries. Divine councils debating what to do about humanity. And finally, Enlil makes a decision, which we'll explore in the next section. But for now, just feel the weight of civilizations rising, cities spreading across the plain between two rivers, each one with its temple and its god and its people who believe their particular patch of ground is the center of the universe, which everywhere always is when you're standing on it. Your location is always the center from your perspective, and the Sumerians had that certainty, reinforced by religious belief. They were living in the land where civilization began, where kingship descended from heaven, where the gods were closest to earth, and archaeology confirms they were living in one of humanity's first urban civilizations. They weren't wrong about their historical importance, even if they were wrong about gods living in temples, but maybe that's the same thing looked at differently. Importance is importance, whether divine or historical, and their importance echoes through millennia to reach you here, now. Listening to stories about people who lived 5,000 years ago and believed things we find strange but structured their lives around beliefs and left traces that we study and interpret and use to fall asleep, connecting ancient voices to modern consciousness through the alchemy of storytelling, and the night deepens still, and the next crisis looms. The flood is coming, though humans don't know it yet, going about their daily lives in cities that will soon be underwater, and this is the part of the narrative where everything we've been building toward comes to catastrophic culmination, divine patience finally exhausted, and Enlil's solution to the noise problem, to human multiplication and increasing chaos, is characteristically extreme and final. He's going to destroy them, all of them, through a great deluge, and this is one of the most famous elements of Mesopotamian mythology, because similar flood stories appear across cultures, the biblical Noah narrative being the most well-known to Western audiences, but the Sumerian version is older, predating Genesis by well over 1,000 years, and the parallels are striking enough that scholars agree there's literary borrowing happening. The biblical flood story derives from Mesopotamian sources, specifically from texts like the Atrahasis epic and the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the character Utnapishtim survives the deluge and later tells Gilgamesh about it, and the details are remarkably similar. Divine decision to destroy humanity, one righteous man warned and told to build a boat, animals saved, water covering everything, bird sent out to find land, boat landing on a mountain, sacrifice made afterward, divine regret, and these parallels have generated extensive scholarly discussion about cultural transmission and shared mythological heritage, how stories move between peoples, how they're adapted and modified while retaining core elements, and the mainstream interpretation is that there was probably a significant flood event or series of events in Mesopotamian prehistory that entered cultural memory and became mythologized. Actual historical trauma transformed into theological narrative explaining divine will and human vulnerability, and there's some geological evidence for major flooding in the Persian Gulf region. Around 5000 BCE, when rising sea levels from glacial melt may have inundated coastal settlements, creating lasting cultural memories of catastrophic deluge, or there could have been a particularly devastating Tigris-Euphrates flood, since the rivers regularly flooded and occasionally disastrously so, and one really bad flood combined with cultural memory could spawn a mythological framework that explains divine justice and human survival. But the fringe interpretation is more dramatic. Some researchers claim the flood represents historical memory of even more ancient cataclysm. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests cometary impacts around 10,900 BCE caused massive flooding and climate upheaval, and if you accept that timeline you can read flood myths as preserving accurate memories from 10,000 years ago, which would be remarkable cultural continuity. Oral tradition maintaining that kind of specific information across hundreds of generations seems unlikely but not completely impossible. Humans are good at stories, and traumatic stories especially tend to persist, revised and elaborated, but retaining core elements, and whether the flood was real or symbolic, or based on actual, if less dramatic events, the narrative serves clear theological purposes, demonstrating divine power, human vulnerability, the importance of obedience, and the possibility of mercy. It's a complete moral framework in one story. And in the Sumerian version, the survivor is Ziusudra, described as a pious king who hears about the coming flood through a dream, or through Enki, who whispers warnings through the reed walls of his house. Classic Enki finding loopholes in divine decrees. Enlil said, "Don't tell humans," but he didn't say, "Don't tell the wall," and the wall could happen to mention it to humans who happen to be listening. It's divine lawyer tactics, technically following orders while completely subverting their intent. And Ziusudra builds a massive boat. The measurements given in the text are huge, and loads it with animals and family, and sets out when the waters come, and the description of the flood is genuinely frightening even now. Water from below and above, the foundations of the earth breaking open, the windows of heaven opening, chaos returning, the separation of heaven and earth that Enlil originally created being temporarily undone, cosmos reverting to primordial ocean, everything that civilization built washed away in divine rage, and it lasts 7 days and 7 nights, a symbolically complete period, and then the waters recede and the boat lands on a mountain, Mount Nisir in the Akkadian version, and Ziusudra makes offerings to the gods, burning incense and roasting meat, and the gods smell the smoke and gather around the sacrifice like flies, which is a surprisingly unflattering description. Gods desperate for offerings because humans who make offerings are dead, and there's regret. Even Enlil realizes he went too far. Destroying humanity entirely means no more offerings, no more temple service. The gods are back to doing their own work, which they already established they hate, so the flood was counterproductive, solved the noise problem by creating a worship problem. And this is actually sophisticated theology disguised as simple narrative, questioning divine justice, acknowledging that even gods make mistakes, suggesting that absolute power doesn't mean perfect wisdom, and Enlil is angry that anyone survived, typical Enlil, but Enki argues that humans are necessary, that complete destruction serves no one, and eventually Enlil agrees, blesses Ziusudra with immortality, which is unusual. Humans aren't supposed to live forever, but this one does as reward for preserving life through the catastrophe, and he's sent to live at the edge of the world in a kind of paradise, removed from normal human affairs, and civilization begins again from the survivors, humanity getting a second chance. But with modifications, the gods implement population control, not through genocide this time, but through built-in natural limits, death and disease and infertility, ensuring humans never again become so numerous that they disturb divine peace. And this is the transition point. After the flood, the timeline shifts from purely mythological to legendary, historical. The king list marks the flood as a major chronological divider. After the flood descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish, and the rulers after the flood have more reasonable reign lengths, hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, still exaggerated but approaching human plausibility, and scholars debate whether this reflects different source materials being combined, earlier mythological traditions spliced with later political records, or whether it represents a conceptual shift in how kingship was understood, divine in origin but human in duration. And archaeologically, the early dynastic period shows continuous cultural development without obvious catastrophic break. No flood layer separating clear before and after, which either means the flood is purely mythological, or it was localized enough not to leave clear widespread evidence, or we haven't found that evidence yet because archaeology is always incomplete. We excavate tiny fractions of ancient sites. Most material evidence is lost to time and decay, so absence of evidence isn't conclusive, but the burden of proof is on those claiming actual historical flood to demonstrate it, and that demonstration is lacking. There's no geological consensus for a flood matching biblical or Mesopotamian descriptions, which leaves us with myth as theology rather than history, which is fine. Myths don't have to be historically accurate to be meaningful. They're not scientific papers. They're narrative frameworks for understanding existence. And the flood story answers important questions. Why do we die? Why is life hard? Why do civilizations fall? Because the gods once destroyed everything and rebuilt with limits. We live in a post-apocalyptic world. Mortality and suffering are consequences of divine reset, which externalizes responsibility. It's not that life is inherently hard, it's that God's made it hard in response to our ancestors' noise, which is both comforting, not your fault personally, and terrifying. Divine will is arbitrary and violent, and Sumerian religion never pretended otherwise. They knew the gods were dangerous, unpredictable, capable of destruction on whims, better to keep them appeased through offerings and proper ritual. Your life depends on divine good mood, which might be influenced by offerings but might not be. Uncertainty is built into the system, and living with that uncertainty, continuing civilization despite knowing it could all end tomorrow if gods get irritated. That's the human condition according to Sumer. And honestly, it's not that different from modern existential awareness. We know asteroids could hit, supervolcanoes could erupt, climate could shift catastrophically. Our civilization is contingent and fragile, but we continue anyway, building and creating and loving, because what else is there to do? Despair is useless. Might as well plant gardens and write poems and maintain social bonds. The Sumerians knew this 5,000 years ago. Their myths acknowledge cosmic indifference and human vulnerability, and then say, but do the work anyway. Maintain the temples, dig the canals, raise the children. Civilization continues through human effort regardless of divine fickleness, which is a kind of courage, defiance even. We're going to keep going, and if you drown us, we'll rebuild. And Enlil learns this. His great flood didn't solve anything really. Humans are back and multiplying again. Noise will return eventually, but perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps the noise is the sound of life, and life is what the cosmos needs. The gods need humanity more than humanity needs gods, which subverts the official theology, but is right there in the text for anyone paying attention. After the flood, the gods are hungry for offerings, dependent on human service. They can destroy us, but they can't thrive without us. Mutual dependence disguised as hierarchical domination, and this is getting quite philosophical for Sumerian mythology. But these texts contain depths that reward close reading. They're not simple. They acknowledge complexities and contradictions. They preserve questions without forcing answers, which makes them more valuable than dogmatic certainty. And after the flood, the narrative shifts. Gods become more distant, less directly involved in human affairs. Kingship is human now, even if divinely authorized. The age of gods walking among humans is ending, transitioning to the age of humans managing their own civilizations with occasional divine input through omens and oracles. And this mirrors the actual historical trajectory. Early city-states became territorial kingdoms, became eventually empires. Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE conquered the Sumerian city-states and united Mesopotamia under single rule, the First Empire, and this required different ideological frameworks, not local patron deities but universal kingship. Sargon claimed authority from Enlil over all lands, expanding the theological scale to match political scale, and subsequent rulers built on this. The Akkadian Empire, the third dynasty of Ur, the Old Babylonian period, each one adapting the Sumerian religious and mythological heritage to new political realities, and the gods became more abstract, more cosmic, less tied to specific cities, though local worship continued, and eventually Marduk of Babylon becomes supreme deity, replacing Enlil in the hierarchy through theological revision documented in the Enuma Elish, which is basically propaganda for Babylonian supremacy disguised as cosmology, retelling. Creation with Marduk as hero, and this is how myths work. They're revised to serve current needs. They're tools of legitimation and meaning-making, flexible frameworks rather than rigid dogma, and the Anunnaki become less prominent in later texts, referred to collectively rather than individually named, their specific personalities fading into generic divine authority. And by the time we reach the late Babylonian period, around 600 BCE, the old Sumerian gods are historical curiosities more than living worship, though the texts are still copied and studied. And then Persian conquest, Greek conquest, Roman conquest, each one bringing new gods and new frameworks, and the Sumerian Anunnaki are forgotten, temples abandoned, cuneiform unreadable, until 19th century archaeologists start digging and translating, and suddenly these ancient voices return, speaking to us across 5,000 years, telling us about gods and floods and creation, and we're the first people in 2,000 years to hear these stories directly from clay tablets rather than filtered through Greek or biblical intermediaries, and that's remarkable. We've recovered lost worlds through archaeology and linguistics. We know things that were unknown for millennia, and future archaeologists might excavate our cities and puzzle over our myths. What did they believe? Why did they build like this? What mattered to them? And hopefully they'll be charitable in their interpretations. See us as we tried to be, rather than just as we failed to be, and the same charity applies to ancient peoples. They were trying to understand their world with the frameworks available to them, doing their best with limited information and heavy uncertainty, and their myths reflect that effort. Attempts to explain why things are the way they are, why we suffer and die and work and create, why civilization exists and sometimes collapses. Big questions that we still ask, and their answers involved gods and floods and divine politics. Our answers involve evolution and psychology and economics, but the questions remain constant. Humans seeking meaning in existence, and these ancient texts remind us that seeking is ancient, that we've always been this way, curious and creative and anxious, building and destroying and rebuilding, telling stories to make sense of chaos, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the point isn't answers but the seeking itself, the human drive to understand and explain and narrate our experience. And on that note the section concludes, flood waters receding, humanity surviving, gods more distant, and the age of myths transitioning into the age of history. Though the boundary between them remains blurry, legends based on real kings, myths explaining actual events, history recorded with theological interpretation, everything tangled together as it always is in human culture. We don't separate cleanly, life is messy and complicated, and our stories reflect that messiness, and you're still here listening to this endless paragraph about Sumerian flood mythology, which means either you're asleep or committed to the premise, or perhaps both. Drifting in that space between waking and sleeping, where long sentences about ancient gods feel appropriate and soothing, and the rhythm of words carries you along like floodwaters, resistless and encompassing, and the night continues. So we arrive at the end of our journey through Sumerian mythology, the age before humans transitioning into the age of humans managing their own affairs, with the gods receding into distant authority, still powerful, but no longer walking among mortals, no longer personally digging canals or creating humans from clay. And this transition represents both mythological evolution and historical reality. As civilizations matured, they needed different theological frameworks. Less immediate divine intervention and more cosmic order maintained through ritual and kingship, and the Anunnaki, who were once characters with personalities and preferences, become abstract principles, divine authority that authorizes human rulers but doesn't directly involve itself in governance. And this is how religions adapt. They modify to remain relevant to changing social conditions, and the Sumerian religious system proved remarkably adaptable. Core myths and deities absorbed into Akkadian culture, then Babylonian, then Assyrian, each one maintaining continuity while making modifications, and elements of these ancient beliefs influenced neighboring cultures, the biblical flood story being the most obvious example, but there are others. Divine councils, creation through separation, cosmic battles between order and chaos. These themes recur across Near Eastern mythology because cultures borrowed from each other, ideas traveled along trade routes, scribes trained in multiple languages, and the ancient world was more connected than we sometimes realize, not isolated civilizations, but networks of exchange and influence. And Sumerian cuneiform was the scholarly language of the ancient Near East for over 2,000 years. Like Latin in medieval Europe, educated people learned it regardless of their native language, which meant Sumerian texts and ideas spread widely, shaping how multiple cultures thought about gods and cosmos and human purpose. And then it faded, cuneiform replaced by alphabetic scripts, Sumerian replaced by Aramaic and eventually Arabic, the old knowledge preserved in libraries that were eventually destroyed or abandoned, and by the early centuries CE probably nobody on Earth could read cuneiform. It was extinct knowledge, mysterious wedge-shaped marks on ancient bricks and tablets, indecipherable. And it stayed that way for almost 2,000 years until Henry Rawlinson and others in the 19th century worked out how to translate cuneiform using the Behistun inscription, a multilingual text like the Rosetta Stone that provided the key to understanding. And suddenly these ancient voices were audible again, not just references in Greek or biblical texts, but direct testimony from the Sumerians themselves. And what they said was both familiar and strange. Familiar because humans are humans across time. We recognize the emotions and concerns. Strange because the specific cultural framework is so foreign, gods living in temples. Civilization existing to serve divine needs, time before history, and yet threading through the strangeness, is recognition. These people worried about meaning and mortality like we do. They told stories to make sense of chaos like we do. They created complex societies and maintained them through shared belief like we do. They're us, just wearing different clothes and speaking a dead language and believing things we find alien but fundamentally recognizable. And that's what makes historical study worthwhile. Not just learning facts about the past, but recognizing our connection to it, seeing humanity's long conversation with itself across millennia, each generation asking similar questions and proposing different answers, building on what came before while adapting to new circumstances. And the Sumerian contribution to that conversation was foundational. They invented writing, which meant ideas could be preserved and transmitted with unprecedented accuracy. They developed mathematics and astronomy and literature. They created the first cities and the first empires. They asked fundamental questions about existence and recorded their answers in clay, and those clay tablets survived fires and floods and the collapse of their civilization. Patient witnesses waiting for someone to learn their language again, and now we have. And we can read their creation myths and flood stories and king lists. We can hear their prayers and curses and love poems. We can glimpse daily life through economic records and legal documents. We can partially reconstruct a world that ended 3,000 years ago, and that reconstruction is always incomplete, always tentative. New discoveries modify our understanding. New translations reveal nuances, but even partial knowledge is valuable. Even fragmentary connection matters. And thinking about the Anunnaki now as we drift towards sleep, whether they were gods or aliens or mythological constructs, the stories themselves have power. They shaped how millions of people understood reality. They influenced cultures across 3,000 years. They contributed to religious and literary traditions that reached eventually even to you, here, now, because biblical narratives were influenced by Mesopotamian ones, and Western culture is thoroughly biblical in heritage, even for non-believers. So these ancient Sumerian stories are part of your cultural DNA whether you knew it or not. Buried in foundation layers of belief and assumption, and recovering them, hearing them directly, is like archaeological excavation of your own cultural consciousness, finding sources and influences and connections you didn't know existed. And maybe that's the real value of studying ancient history, not just learning what happened, but understanding how we got here, what intellectual and cultural journeys brought us to where we are, what questions humans have always asked and what answers we've proposed and discarded. And Sometimes returned to, because it's a conversation, every generation contributing, and you're part of it. Your thoughts and questions and beliefs are contributions to humanity's ongoing attempt to understand existence, and someday future people might look back at our time and find our beliefs as strange as we find Sumerian myths. They'll wonder why we believed what we believed. They'll see patterns we're blind to, they'll recognize influences we don't see, and hopefully they'll be charitable, recognize that we were trying our best with the information available, just like every generation does, and the Sumerians were trying too, creating elaborate theological systems, maintaining complex rituals, building impressive cities, all in service of what they believed was cosmic truth. And who's to say they were wrong? Maybe there's more to reality than our current scientific frameworks capture. Maybe gods exist in dimensions we don't perceive. Maybe consciousness is more fundamental than matter. Or maybe not. Maybe it's all just humans creating meaning in an indifferent universe, telling ourselves stories so we can sleep at night. Literally in this case, you've listened to over 13,000 words about ancient Mesopotamian mythology specifically to help you sleep, which is a very human thing to do, seeking comfort in old stories, letting the rhythm of narrative carry you into unconsciousness. And I hope it's working. I hope you're drowsy and comfortable and ready to drift off. And if you enjoyed this journey through Sumerian myths, I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel. Genuinely, no pressure. But if this kind of content helps you sleep or interests you while awake, subscribing means you'll see more of it, and you can leave comments with suggestions for future topics, other ancient civilizations or historical periods or mythological systems you'd like explored in this format, because there's endless material. Human history is vast and strange, and full of fascinating stories that deserve retelling, and doing it in this bedtime format, long unbroken paragraphs with gentle sarcasm and historical detail and occasional jokes, apparently works for some people, helps them relax and learn simultaneously, and that's a nice combination: sleep and education, rest and curiosity, your brain processing ancient Sumerian mythology while you drift into dreams where maybe you'll visit Eridu, or watch the floodwaters rise, or have a conversation with Enki, who seems like he'd be interesting to talk to, clever and mischievous, and fundamentally on humanity's side. And wherever your dreams take you tonight, I hope they're pleasant. I hope you wake rested and ready for whatever tomorrow brings. And I hope somewhere in the back of your mind you remember that you're part of an ancient story, humans seeking meaning, creating civilization, telling stories, the same things the Sumerians did 5,000 years ago, the same things humans will do 5,000 years from now if we survive that long. It's what we do, it's what makes us human, and there's something beautiful about that continuity, something reassuring about knowing that the fundamental human project continues regardless of technological change or political upheaval. We keep asking questions, we keep seeking answers, we keep telling stories, and those stories connect us across vast gulfs of time to people we'll never meet but can somehow understand, and understanding is what it's all about. Reaching across difference to find commonality, recognizing ourselves in ancient clay tablets pressed with reed styluses by hands that turned to dust millennia ago but whose thoughts somehow survived, preserved in the most durable medium humans ever invented. Written words, ideas that outlast empires, stories that survive the cultures that created them, and the Anunnaki now are fading, receding into the distance as you sink deeper into sleep, their names becoming just sounds: Enlil and Enki and Inanna and all the rest, gods or aliens or metaphors or dreams themselves, and it doesn't matter anymore, not right now. All that matters is the rhythm of breath and the comfort of blankets and the darkness behind closed eyes where ancient Mesopotamia dissolves into general peaceful nothing. And tomorrow you can research if you want, look up the actual Assyriological debates, or read translations of the Atrahasis epic, or watch videos about ancient astronaut theories, or you can just let it be a pleasant memory of a bedtime story that helped you sleep. That's fine too. Not everything needs follow-up. Sometimes a story is just a story and its value is simply in the telling and the hearing. And on that note, I'll let you go, release you into sleep, into dreams, into the restful darkness that all humans need. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this strange project of ancient history as sleep aid, and sleep well, deeply, peacefully. Knowing that humans have been doing this for thousands of years, lying down at night and seeking rest, sometimes thinking about gods and creation and cosmic purpose, sometimes thinking about nothing at all, just grateful for another day survived and the promise of another one coming. And the Sumerians felt this too, this end-of-day gratitude and weariness, this surrender to sleep's necessity. They're not so different from you, separated by time but not by essential humanity. And with that connection, maybe you can rest easier, knowing you're part of something ancient and ongoing, the human story, still being written, still surprising us, still worth telling. And good night now, truly. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Let the words fade. Let the ancient world recede. Let sleep come gently and completely. And I'll see you in the next one if you want to take another journey through history. But for now, just rest, just sleep, just be, and know that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, here, now, drifting peacefully toward dreams, and the Anunnaki watch from whatever realm they inhabit. Gods or memories or stories we told ourselves, watching as you sleep, as all humans sleep, as the world turns through night toward dawn, and everything continues, has always continued, will always continue, the great wheel turning, seasons changing, civilizations rising and falling, and through it all, humans sleeping and waking and sleeping again, and you're part of that endless cycle, resting now, gathering strength for tomorrow, and that's good, that's right. That's how it should be. So sleep now, sleep deeply, sleep well, sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.